Have you ever stopped to think about what really holds a company together? Or even a neighborhood or a simple club? It's not just about having great ideas or awesome people, right? Deep down, under the surface of every single successful organization, you'll find its governing documents. These are the essential and yet often invisible rules that are basically the blueprint for order. So let's pull back the curtain on this and really dig into this foundational framework.
I mean, we've all seen it happen, haven't we? A brilliant startup, a really passionate community project, maybe a team with just incredible potential, and then it just fizzles out. Or worse, it just descends into total chaos. It makes you wonder, right? Why do some of the best ideas, the ones that seem destined for success, just completely fall apart?
While the answer, and this is true more often than not, isn't really about how good the idea was, it's about the quality of its structure. Yeah, it all comes back to the blueprint. If you don't have a clear plan for how you're going to build, how you're going to operate, and how you're going to make decisions, even the most amazing concepts can just crumble under pressure.
And that right there is exactly what governing documents are. They're the constitutional infrastructure, a fancy way of saying they're the system that turns a group's shared goal into actual on-the-ground operational order. Think of it like this. They're the bridge that connects the big, shared vision to all the practical, everyday steps you need to take to make it real.
Okay, so to really get how this works, we can break it down into a simple three-stage process. You can think of it as a kind of map of meaning. First up, you've got the foundation. This is what gives the idea life in the eyes of the law. Then comes operation, which is all about setting the internal rules of the game. And finally, you have enforcement, which is how you make sure those rules actually stick in the real world. All right, let's dive into that first step, the foundation. This is the magic moment, really. It's where an abstract idea gets its very own legal identity. You could even call it its juridical DNA. This is the point where something goes from just being a concept in someone's head to a legally recognized entity.
For a lot of businesses, this whole process kicks off with the Articles of Incorporation. This is the official piece of paper you file with the state that basically shouts, "Hello world, we exist!" It's what legally creates the corporation as something called a juridical person. A great way to think about it is like this. The law just handed the company its very own passport. Now it can travel, own property, and do business all on its own. Pretty cool, huh? Now, another really similar foundational document is the charter. You see these for things like cities, universities, or other big institutions. A charter is basically the authoritative legal document that grants its very existence. It officially defines its purpose, its powers, and lays out exactly what it's allowed to do. It's the "you are hereby created" document. So what's the big deal? What does this all mean in the real world? Well, it means these foundational documents are the things that make an idea legally real. They take a simple notion and give it a name, a core purpose, and crucially, the legitimacy to actually do things in the world. Without this step, an organization is really just a group of people with a plan. With it, it becomes an institution. That's a huge difference. Okay, let's move on to stage 2 and see how this all builds. So, once an entity legally exists, it needs an internal rulebook. Think of it like an operating system that tells it how to function day in and day out. And this is where things get really interesting, because it clears up a super common point of confusion. Those articles of incorporation we just talked about, that's a public declaration to the state. But the bylaws, that's the internal rulebook. See the difference? Bylaws aren't filed publicly. They're adopted by the organization for the organization to govern itself. The bylaws are where you find all the nitty-gritty details. We're talking about how managers are chosen, what the different officers' roles are, how meetings are supposed to be run, how votes get counted, all that stuff. They take those big, broad powers from the charter and they operationalize them. They turn that abstract authority into concrete step-by-step procedures. And here's another key example of one of these operating system documents, the LLC Operating Agreement. If you have a limited liability company or an LLC, this is the absolutely critical private agreement that spells everything out. It says who owns what percentage, who's in charge of making decisions, and how the money flows. It's basically the user manual for the entire business. So why does any of this matter so much? Because these documents, they establish the rules of the game for everyone, period. They define who's responsible for what, they guide the decision-making process, and they give you a framework for sorting out disagreements,
Without them, a simple argument over strategy can explode into a full-blown existential crisis for the organization. They are, without a doubt, your first line of defense against internal chaos.
Okay, so we've seen how these organizations are born and how they're supposed to run on the inside. But what happens when the rubber meets the road? How do these rules actually function out in the real world? Well, that's where we get to see this living ecosystem of rules really take shape. The source material puts it just perfectly, calling it an ecosystem of order. And in this system, you've got this two-way flow. Authority flows downwards, from the law down to the charter, and then down to the internal policies. But at the exact same time, responsibility flows upwards, from an individual's action all the way back up the chain to make sure there's accountability. It's a really elegant system when you think about it.
And you can see this ecosystem everywhere in your own life. Seriously. In a big corporation, you've got a shareholder agreement to make sure the owner's goals and the company's goals are aligned. In your neighborhood, it's the HOA rules that maintain community standards. And hey, every single time you go online, you are interacting with a website's terms of use. They're all governing documents.
Let's just zoom in on that last one for a second. A website's terms of use is a perfect example of a modern governing document. It is, for all intents and purposes, a contract you agree to, usually by clicking a button, and it sets all the rules, how you can use the service, who's on the hook if something goes wrong, and who actually owns the content. It is, literally, governance for the digital age. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, it becomes crystal clear that these documents are so much more than just paperwork. They really represent the enduring power of having a written framework to create order and to allow people to act together collectively. The key takeaway, the keystone principle here, is that governance is the link. It connects legitimacy to operation. It's what ensures that every single decision, every single action can be traced all the way back to a lawful, documented source of authority. And that is what separates an organized, accountable group from a random, unpredictable mob. And that brings us to what I think is the most powerful idea from all of this. It's this quote: "Governing documents are not static records, but living constitutions." Just think about that. They aren't dusty files in a cabinet. They're the living texts through which our institutions are constantly figuring out their power, their purpose, and their place in the world. So I'll leave you with a question to chew on. What are the invisible rules that govern your world? The charters, the bylaws, the terms of use. What's the blueprint for the things you're a part of? I guarantee once you start looking for them, you'll start seeing them absolutely everywhere.